1986 was a year hallmarked by many striking images. It brought conflict and terror, great political upheavals and social unrest. But scenes also of hope and potential that long-lasting problems could be overcome. Science advanced and records fell. It was a year of memories which have been preserved here in this series for all time. In 1986, America held a special birthday party, and French President Mitterrand made a rare sortie into English.
Happy birthday, United States! Happy birthday, Miss Liberty!
President Reagan gave the cue, and the celebrations began in earnest. The Statue of Liberty was 100 years old, and had had a $30 million facelift in honor of her birthday. A symbol of freedom, she was a gift from France to commemorate the Franco-American alliance during the War of Independence. The year began on a hopeful note, as President Reagan's New Year's address included a message for the Russian people, which was broadcast on Soviet television.
Mr. Gorbachev and I agreed we will seek agreements on the principle of 50% reductions in offensive nuclear arms and an interim agreement on intermediate-range nuclear systems. And it's my hope that one day we will be able to eliminate these weapons altogether and rely increasingly for our security on defense systems that threaten no one. Both the United States and Soviet Union are doing research on the possibilities of applying new technologies to the cause of defense. If these technologies become a reality, it is my dream that to one day free us all from the threat of nuclear destruction.
But the improvement did not last. US-Soviet relations suffered a hiccup which threatened the ongoing peace initiative when Russian scientist Gennady Zakharov was arrested. In a move considered fabricated to secure Zakharov's release, American journalist Nicholas Danilov was arrested in Moscow. Intense political activity by both sides resulted in the two men being released, although the Americans denied it was a swap.
Our hostage in Moscow, Mr. Danilov, has been transferred to the custody of our ambassador and will be in the embassy there. We are so relieved and happy that Mr. Danilov is out of that 8 by 10 foot cell which he was sharing with someone we think was an informant.
Details were announced simultaneously by American Secretary of State George Shultz and by Russian Foreign Minister Edvard Shevardnadze, whilst Gennady Zakharov was released by the court in New York. President Reagan then took the platform for an even more momentous announcement.
Yeah, that's what I was here to tell you about. The meeting was proposed by General Secretary Gorbachev, and I've accepted, and it will take place in the context of preparations for the General Secretary's visit to the United States.
The invitation was delivered at the height of the Danilov affair. Zakharov's release salvaged the talks for the Russians, too.
The General Secretary will visit the United States at a date that will be agreed between him and President Reagan.
The summit went ahead in Reykjavik in October. The initial agreement ended in stalemate when Mr. Gorbachev made it conditional on Mr. Reagan dropping his planned strategic defense initiative in outer space. President Reagan wouldn't give ground, and the two leaders reached an impasse, although further talks were planned for the future. The British government faced a crisis over the Westland affair. A European consortium backed by Defense Secretary Michael Heseltine and an American-led group were rival bidders for the ailing helicopter company. The Defense Secretary's position was undermined when a confidential letter was leaked.
If the basis of trust between the Prime Minister and her Defense Secretary no longer exists, there is no place for me, with honor, in such a cabinet.
Lacking cabinet support, the Defense Secretary resigned, to be followed by Leon Britton, the Trade and Industry Secretary, who had backed the other bid. Heseltine vowed to fight on.
Enough people are beginning to do the sums to indicate that there will certainly be enough shareholders to adjourn the meeting and almost certainly enough shareholders to actually vote down resolutions 2 and 3, which are those which give effect to the American proposals.
Britain's press was thrown into turmoil as Rupert Murdoch's News International moved from Fleet Street to a new plant in Wapping, sacking 6,000 print workers in the process. Nonetheless, the first print runs did get out.
We got out nearly the full run of the Sunday Times. The delivery was spotty. We were late in London. We missed about 30% of the retailers in London. Across the country, we got nearly everywhere. We didn't get to Norfolk. We didn't get to part of Southampton. Most places, Sunday Times, absolutely right.
But Union fury built up, the plant was besieged, and violence broke out. Fireworks heralded the London Stock Exchange's Big Bang, as traditional practices were abandoned and a new computerized share-dealing system came into action for the first time. Foreign companies gained access into the exchange and fixed-rate commissions on deals were abandoned. Naturally, there were some teething troubles. City celebrations of the new opportunity to make money contrasted with unemployment, which reached 11.9% in 1986. The jobless marched again, and the Prime Minister was forced to take notice.
Yes, there are still dragons to be slain, most notably unemployment, and other challenges still to meet.
Opposition leader Neil Kinnock had his own challenge. Labour's conference in Blackpool ended with a commitment amongst the leadership to disassociate the party from the extreme left-wing element. Derek Hatton, former deputy leader of Liverpool Council, was already expelled, but the militants wouldn't give up without a fight. Neither would Peter Wright. The ex-intelligence officer's revelations of dirty tricks sparked off attempts to suppress publication of his book in the Australian courts. The British government failed to have Spycatcher banned. Violence flared again in Northern Ireland when a loyalist march was rerouted away from the main street of Keady, County Armagh. The 15th anniversary of internment was marked by both Republican and Loyalist riots across the province. Despite hopes for a relaxation of tension, war games continued unabated on NATO's front line. Mrs. Thatcher witnessed the mock battle during an official visit to West Germany. French President François Mitterrand bade a fond farewell to outgoing socialist Prime Minister Laurent Fabius, and had to learn to live with Jacques Chirac, leader of the right. Chirac's views seemed to promise an uneasy partnership.
A country where 50% about of the national wealth is taken by the government to be redistributed is a socialist country. Then the main purpose of a new government, on my point of view, is to decrease year after year the rate of taxes, of all kind of taxes, to broke those socialists' structure.
Suspected terrorist Georges Abdallah was held in France and charged with complicity in the murder of US military attaché Charles Ray in 1982. Arab supporters demanded his release and launched a series of bomb attacks in Paris to secure it. Prime Minister Jacques Chirac announced tough new measures against terrorism as 6 bomb outrages in 2 weeks rocked the capital. Tension increased between Libya and the United States when the US Sixth Fleet deployed a massive presence off the Libyan coast. Continued Libyan-backed terrorist attacks against American targets convinced President Reagan that direct action was necessary.
We're not going to just sit here and hold still. And right now, with the most recent activities, I can't get specific with you because I can only tell you that we are investigating and trying to gather all the information we can so that we can actually, with solid evidence, point a finger at who is responsible.
Information received alleged that a Libyan diplomat based in East Germany had planted the bomb at La Belle Discotheque in West Berlin, which left 1 American and 1 Turk dead. The West German government expelled 2 Libyan diplomats from Bonn, but they wouldn't come out in support of direct action. Finally, the president decided that enough was enough, and that an example should be made of Colonel Gaddafi. His frustration was clear.
I find he's not only a barbarian, but he's flaky.
Britain supported the United States by allowing American F-111 bombers to take off from bases at Lakenheath and Upper Heyford to join those aircraft attacking Libya from carriers stationed in the Mediterranean. The attacks were concentrated around Tripoli and Benghazi, where Gaddafi had his military headquarters and administration buildings. There were few direct hits, but a number of civilian casualties. Gaddafi was unharmed. In Lebanon, Beirut continued to be torn apart with massive car bombs devastating the Christian sector of the city. But there was some good news, as 2 French television newsmen, Georges Hansen and Philippe Rochaud, held hostage for more than a year, arrived back in Paris. In another success, lengthy negotiations between Terry Waite, the Archbishop of Canterbury's envoy, and the captors of American hostage Dan Jacobson finally secured his freedom. He was quick to prove how fit he'd kept.
Would anyone like to go out and challenge me to 6-mile jog around the airport this morning? It's really a great pleasure to see this guy here. Not because he has a beard like I have, but we almost had an opportunity to meet last Christmas. And even though Terry Waite's venture in Beirut did not bring us out, this man did one thing that we really appreciated. As we sat on the floor in our underwear on the day of Christmas Eve, he gave us hope.
Riots broke out in Egypt. In the shadow of the pyramids, tanks moved in as 8,000 conscripts in the security police reacted violently to rumors that their military service was extended from 3 to 4 years. On a happier note, the Egyptian president held talks with Israel's Prime Minister Shimon Peres in Alexandria. A new era of peace was hoped for when the two leaders reached an agreement to establish a committee to pave the way for an international conference on Middle East problems.
My own feeling is that in our talks, most of them face to face, under 4 eyes, we have reached much more understanding.
The Palestinian problem would be a major topic of future talks. The Wailing Wall was the scene of more Israeli celebration. Human rights activist Anatoly Sharansky had finally arrived in Israel after serving 8 years in a Russian labor camp. It had taken the Soviet dissident 13 years and unimaginable hardship to achieve his goal. Fellow dissident Andrei Sakharov was also released from internal exile after 6 years. These were among the first indications of real changes in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev continued his plans for reform in a 6-hour speech to the Communist Party Congress. It was the first time the General Secretary had addressed Congress since becoming leader, and the details of his 5-year plan were broadcast live to the Russian people. Part of the plan was to introduce better quality goods for sale in Russia. Constant criticism from consumers at shoddy standards was endorsed by Mikhail Gorbachev, who decreed that Russian citizens had the right to expect a better deal. The old Russia was to make way for the new. A modern building project dwarfed the Moscow skyline, typical of a determination to tackle appalling housing standards. the new openness was to be tested, as Russia experienced the world's worst civil nuclear disaster. The number 4 reactor at Chernobyl nuclear power station exploded. Firemen who fought to control the blaze were amongst the first casualties. 2 died immediately, and many more were admitted to hospital suffering the effects of radiation. Rescue teams burrowed underneath the burning reactor and pumped it full of concrete to prevent possible meltdown from the white-hot core. Helicopters dumped a mixture of sand, lead, and special chemicals to extinguish the runaway nuclear reaction. Once the immediate danger was past, the reactor was entombed in concrete to prevent further leaks. A political experiment took place in South Africa. Talks began in Durban to set up the first multiracial government in the province of Natal. But rioting continued unabated in the townships. The South African government lost its only black ally when Samora Machel, president of Mozambique, was killed in a plane crash. Ferdinand Marcos lost his stranglehold on the Philippines. With a sinking economy and growing communist and Muslim insurgents, Marcos held presidential elections in an attempt to maintain vital US support. His main opponent was Corazon Aquino, widow of the former opposition leader assassinated in 1983. Massive electoral fraud was witnessed by international observers, and the election campaign resulted in 100 deaths. Marcos was one of the few who managed to vote without incident. His subsequent victory was announced in the National Assembly.
Ferdinand E. Marcos as the duly elected president.
An independent electoral watchdog disputed the result, and troops loyal to Mrs. Aquino stormed Manila's main TV and radio station. America was quick to recognize her as the new president.
The United States extends recognition to this new government, headed by President Aquino. We pay special tribute to her for her commitment to nonviolence, which has earned her the respect of all Americans.
And the US provided a transport plane to carry the deposed president on the final stage of his journey into exile in Hawaii. "1986 saw other departures amongst the world's powerful. Jubilation on the streets of Haiti at the news that their president was deposed was slightly premature. Supporters of Jean-Claude Duvalier tried to fight back, but the US withheld aid to his regime, and a military coup ensured that Baby Doc finally fled into exile in France, taking with him a cool £100 million. Benazir Bhutto returned to Pakistan to launch a nationwide campaign for free elections. She seemed full of peaceful intentions.
Well, I feel extremely calm and extremely at peace with myself. I thought as the time came near, I'd start feeling adrenaline flowing through my veins. But at the moment, I just feel very peaceful.
But her confidence was short-lived. Thousands of protesters clashed with police in Karachi, and Benazir Bhutto and other opposition party leaders were arrested during demonstrations against President Zia. Restoration of democracy in Pakistan seemed as far off as ever. Mikhail Gorbachev arrived in India, the Soviets' closest non-communist ally. It was the Russian leader's first official visit to Asia, where Rajiv Gandhi hailed him as a crusader for peace. Pope John Paul II, another crusader, arrived in Australia and endeared himself to a true Australian. Despite a failed assassination attempt in Brisbane, the Pope went on to Sydney, where minor scuffles broke out with anti-Roman Catholic protesters.
Yeah, that's why you come here.
Sydney Cricket Ground was the venue for the spectacular Celebration of Youth. In San Francisco, AIDS was taking an appalling toll. There was urgent need for intensified research into the virus, but the Reagan administration was cutting back on health budgets. Actress Elizabeth Taylor testified before a Senate Appropriations Committee to appeal for more funding. Since the death of her friend Rock Hudson, Miss Taylor had actively campaigned on behalf of the American Foundation for AIDS Research.
That are being spent today.
There was some humor in the proceedings, as her former husband, John Warner, was one of the committee. The United States remained involved in a war it could never win. The most sophisticated technology was employed in the fight against drug trafficking. The briefing over, a highly trained SWAT team was ready to go into action to try to wipe out an industry with a turnover of $1,000 million a year. To try to stop the drugs at source, the United States launched Operation Blast Furnace with the cooperation of the Bolivian government. Cocaine's victims were everywhere. Bolivian children were constantly victimized by police when caught trying to satisfy their habit. This boy had eaten his fingers and the craving for cocaine had become too much. Addiction recognized no social structures. In London, the Marquis of Blandford, heir to Blenheim Palace, walked free from court. The former addict had the wealth and support needed to buy a cure. So did Boy George, cult figure and pop star. Although he was convicted of drugs charges, Boy George was freed by the court and still had the adulation of his fans. Another perennial problem, famine, ravaged the Sudan. But neither the Sudan People's Liberation Army nor the central government would allow the international relief charity Operation Rainbow to fly supplies to the starving. As so often, civil war made the problems of coping with natural shortages and exploding populations even harder.
I really say very clearly, it is not possible to police the whole South.
A state of emergency was declared in San Salvador, following an earthquake that devastated the city. The worst tragedy in the history of American space exploration struck the shuttle Challenger. Its 7 crew included Christa McAuliffe, a schoolteacher and the first civilian chosen for a space mission, and Dr. Ronald McNair, the first black astronaut. At a memorial service for Challenger's crew, President Reagan comforted their relatives. The shuttle program was postponed indefinitely, and the way seemed open for European and Chinese launchers to take a commercial lead. When Concorde celebrated its 10th anniversary of commercial service in 1986, 14 aircraft were in service with British Airways and Air France. Despite the cost, the supersonic plane had proved a masterpiece of aviation technology. New York's East River saw the start of Richard Branson's second attempt to break the transatlantic record.
It's not winning a lot of things, and I think that most of the country seem to be very much behind the project and would like to see us actually win something for a change.
The first Atlantic Challenger had been lost when she broke up 138 miles from success. Branson was well equipped for emergencies on this attempt. Three days, 8 hours and 31 minutes later, Challenger 2 passed the finish line at the Bishop's Rock Lighthouse, beating the record held by the liner United States since 1952.
We ought to be feeling very tired, but we're just feeling absolutely wonderful, I think. I mean, if you can think of this sort of welcome, well, in the middle of a cup final match, you couldn't be more appropriate. What kept you? The sea!
Was it worth it?
Of course it is!
Will you do it again?
Never!
The crowds in Canterbury were far from enthusiastic when Mrs. Thatcher and President Mitterrand arrived for the signing of the Channel Tunnel Agreement. Communities in Kent planned to fight the proposals, and Mrs. Thatcher tried to allay their fears.
Many of you are concerned about the consequences the link will have for the local environment and for employment in the area. Let me assure you, the government is alive to your concerns. I would urge the people of Kent to treat the link as an opportunity, an undertaking that will bring long-term and lasting benefits.
The investitures at Buckingham Palace were a star-studded occasion. England goalkeeper Peter Shilton received the MBE for his work in sport. Bob Geldof was his irrepressible self, in spite of the mourning suit. Geldof received the KBE and became an honorary knight for his work in famine relief in Africa.
When I was talking to the Queen, it was fine, you know, no problem.
What did you get the medal?
She said it was a small token for what you've done. It must have been very hard work. And I said, not as hard as getting into this thing. And she said, yes, I can see that.
Philanthropist and virtual recluse J. Paul Getty II also received the KBE. The American millionaire had lived in Britain for more than 15 years and preferred anonymity. Geldof wouldn't let him escape this time.
Where's your medal, Getty?
Walked off with it.
The stars were out in force for the best birthday ever in aid of the Prince's Trust. Elton John sported his new hair for the occasion. Paul McCartney and Rick Parfitt were there, as was Tina Turner, the Queen of Rock. "80,000 fans packed Wembley for Wham's farewell concert. fair share of George Michael lookalikes amongst them. The fans received a special message from George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley.
Oh yeah, to anyone who's not here
Especially
today.
people who didn't manage to get tickets, you know. We'd love to have seen everyone off personally, but can't do it.
With no regrets about splitting up. So a huge thank you to everyone, not only today, but for the last 4 years.
Perestroika reached the Russian fashion scene. Austere styles were being replaced with more individual clothes of better quality and cut to meet consumer demands. In Moscow, the state-run fashion industry actively encouraged the students to develop new techniques, which were reflected on the catwalks. In Japan, there was a festival of record-breaking events. Amongst the competitors was a Frenchman who jumped from a crane high above the city skyline. Another feat, or perhaps 100 of them, was 50 runners with their legs tied firmly together, attempting to cover a 30-meter course. Britain's Hampton Court Palace was ravaged by fire. The blaze was started by a candle in the grace and favour apartment of Lady Daphne Gale, who died in the fire in the south wing. Environment Minister Kenneth Baker was unstinting in his praise for rescue efforts.
They've got here very quickly. I have the greatest praise for them. They've done marvellously. They saved the people, which is important, and they and our own staff saved as much as we could of what are quite irreplaceable parts of our history.
Queen Elizabeth visited the scene of the fire and was shown the destruction in the Khartoum Gallery and most of the royal apartments. The Queen took a happier break from affairs of state when she arrived in Kentucky on a private visit. purpose of the Queen's holiday was to inspect her 6 brood mares, which were at stud in the Bluegrass state. The Great Wall was the high spot of the Queen's state visit to China. Queen Elizabeth was the first British monarch ever to visit the country and proved a determined sightseer. Down in the valley, the Queen continued her sightseeing tour along the Sacred Way to the burial site of the Ming dynasty. At Buckingham Palace, the news finally became official. On the 19th of March, Prince Andrew became engaged to Sarah Ferguson. There was the obligatory photo call, but it was a relaxed affair, with the prince joking with the same newsman who had hounded Sarah over the previous weeks.
Oh, you missed it! Go for it.
The photo session over, the couple gave their first TV interview.
I asked Sarah some weeks ago, and Sarah actually said yes, which surprised me. She did say it also, which a little anecdote for you, is that she said if you wake up tomorrow morning, you could tell me it's all a huge joke. I didn't.
Sarah sitting here.
Finally, on the 23rd of June, Prince Andrew, now Duke of York, set off to Westminster Abbey.
I, Sarah Margaret.
I, Sarah Margaret.
Take thee, Andrew Albert Christian Edward.
Take thee, Andrew Albert Christian Edward.
To my wedded husband.
To my wedded husband.
And those were some of the memories of the year 1986.